Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brady, and for this week's episode, I'm joined by my co-host, Matt Scott, and we have a special interview today with Dave Harriton of AEV. Now, Dave is the CEO, he's the founder of AEV, and we had the rare opportunity to sit down with Dave and talk about some really important subjects, which includes payload, it includes these new OEM vehicle capabilities that we're seeing coming out. We talk a lot about mid-size versus full-size. Yeah, Dave is really the Einstein of overlanding. He has really developed a lot of the types of products and levels of aftermarket production quality. So we really have a rare opportunity to talk with him about how he integrates with the OEMs, the lessons that he's learned from working with the OEMs, and how to make premium quality aftermarket components for overland travel. But we really do the deep dive on payload, and we talk about a lot of other really important subjects. So please enjoy our conversation with Dave Harriton.
And a special thanks to Kuat racks for their support of this week's podcast. Their new Ibex has landed. It's actually overlanded. This groundbreaking bed rack is effortlessly handling substantial loads both on and off the grid. Constructed from lightweight yet durable aluminum, it boasts a ballistic black powder coat made for all the nature you can throw at it. It's available in 6 different frame sizes to accommodate most truck models, and it's equipped with telescoping crossbars, numerous T-channels, and a versatile full and half height configuration right out of the box. This is the Ibex from Kuat. It is engineered for adventure. For more details, please visit Kuat.com. Kuat, because you will absolutely love this bed rack.
So Dave, thanks so much for being back on the podcast with us. For those that are listening, Dave Harriton, we recorded a podcast kind of about his career and life and a lot of his learnings around overlanding and his vehicles. We recorded that maybe about a year and a half ago or so. But we are grateful to have you back on here because we're going to dig deep. We're going to dive deep into some technical topics that I think people will find really interesting. We talk a lot about payload on this podcast. And now
some say we beat a dead horse on it.
Yeah, but now you're going to actually understand the engineering behind payload and some of the factors that come into the decision about what vehicle you buy and what vehicle it may or what payload it may have from the factory. So Dave, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised it's taken this long to get back to your.
Well, let's first talk about how did you get to the podcast today, because this is fascinating.
Yeah, I flew my Husky in from Las Vegas this morning. And yeah, it's kind of like a flying Jeep.
Yeah, flying KTM or a flying Jeep. So, and what's the size tires that it has on it?
It's got 29s right now. I'll probably upgrade to 31s here next set.
So this is a tail dragger,
mm-hmm.
and if you were describing it earlier, it's based on like a 1940s design of an aircraft. And what inspired you to decide to start flying?
It's always been something that's interested me. And, since I was a kid, but like everybody, time and money, right?
Yeah.
And they never seem to coincide. And then I had a buddy who had actually my plane, and he had been taking me for some, backseat rides around Montana, and I was like pretty blown away. And then at one point he was like, "Hey, I'm going to buy a new one. Do you want this one?" And I was like, "Yep." I didn't even think about it. I was like, "Yep, I'll take it." And so then I had a real motivation to, go put the effort and work into getting a license.
Because it was a lot of work.
It's a lot of work to fly a tail dragger. It's a perishable skill, and it does require some specialized training. And then flying in the mountains requires specialized training.
Because I think the last time you were here, you were just finishing up your private pilot. Yeah.
Yep. So now 600 hours later, which is a lot in 2 years.
While you're trying to work full time?
I do work. Yeah, work full time
and design OEM level quality products. Yeah. I think there was a couple times you and I were texting. I don't know what time in the morning it was, probably around 1 a.m, and you had flown for 4 hours that day, and then you then you were shifting into Michigan time, because you had to work from like 3 a.m. until whenever. Crazy.
Yeah, my day normally starts at 5:30 with some of the East Coast meetings, and but I go to bed pretty early. So it's a lot of work, but it's so worth it, because I have explored so much on dual sport bikes, dirt bikes, Jeeps, trucks, snowmobiles. I've explored rafting, kayaking, that now when I fly, I can generally put everything below me together, and I've focused. I've been in so many places in this country. It's pretty fun to put it all together, at least in the Western U.S.
And you were talking. In fact, one of your Instagram posts I thought was really cool because it showed your plane, and here's a Nemo tent, and you just brought your camping gear with you. You landed and camped out for the night. Yeah,
I always keep my pretty comfortable, quote unquote survival kit.
Yeah.
And the guys from Overland were out in the desert, and I flew out there. And, spent the night with them and camped around the fire, and that was pretty nice because they had an AEV prospector with a 4-wheel camper, and they had all the stuff.
Food.
Oh yeah, they had
food,
steaks,
beer, everything else.
Potatoes. It was great. I had a beer. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, Dave, because you were involved in very early on, even before the 4-wheel drive stuff, with whitewater kayaking, and then you moved into the Jeeps, and you've moved into full size, and you've gotten involved, a personal passion in sports cars, and now aircraft. Do you feel like that's because it helps you in the creative process?
Not only in the totally, but not only in the creative process, but it also it helps me mentally, having something outside of work to focus on. But it also really, like, you learn so many things in other facets that you can bring back into work. Whether it's flying and how people do certain things, how airplanes are, whether it's maintained or, you could say everything from, like, a simple example, be safety wired or something, all the way up to, communication skills or packing light, dealing with payload, things like that. Really, or, same on a motorcycle, right? You've ridden all over. It makes a big difference whether you're light or heavy.
Yeah.
And so, that weight's one thing, but there's so many things where it just adds to your quiver, when you have all these experiences that you can add to your quiver to make truly unique solutions.
Yeah, I would think that there's times when you're flying, because it's not like you're on Instagram when you're flying a plane. So you probably are able to let your creative mind wander a bit.
Actually, I don't. Like when I'm flying, I'm tending, I just want to survive, right? So I'm like focused, really focused.
Okay.
Which is the kind of the mental.
Yeah, I've never been a pilot, so that's interesting to know you. There's not downtime, huh?
Yeah, but the focus can be a break too.
In other types of flying, there is, a lot of, like, if you're in a corporate jet, honestly, you get up and you've already done so much work on the ground, and you've already entered it into the plane, and now you're just managing systems and managing air traffic control and just kind of waiting for your number to be said, and then doing whatever they tell you to do, and you could wander for sure, unless there's emergency. When you're flying these bush planes, it's a completely different thing where you're focused. You're pretty much focused all the time on, like, because you're not normally going from place to place. You do, but a lot of times you're like, well, I'm going to go from place to place, but I'm going to land 6 times in the middle somewhere, and so you're kind of just focused on that. But like I said, for me, it's a mental distraction where it really requires focus, and it almost trains me to be able to focus. So when I do sit down at my computer, I can focus on something.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's actually it helps you fine tune your ability to focus on your work.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh, that's interesting. So you wanted to talk a little bit about payload. So the one example that you brought up that I think is worth diving into is that within the mid-size truck market, one of the challenges has always been payload. But now we're seeing vehicles like the new GMC Canyon or the Colorado from Chevrolet, and they're available in an AEV Bison variant, where they have 35-inch tall tires, steel bumpers. You can even get some of them with a winch, Boron steel skid plates. They come with a lot of the things that people would normally install from the aftermarket. And so if you were to simply look at the payload number on the door, it's a little misleading, because you would have to, if you bought, like, let's say, a stock Ranger and you wanted to add all of those things, the Ranger, yes, may have a 1,600-pound payload or a 1,700-pound payload. But by the time you add steel bumpers and winches and everything else.
Yeah, and particularly the products that you're adding in the aftermarket just really aren't considered much for weight. I always feel like, it's more cardboard-aided design a lot of times. Not that some of those products aren't tough or durable, but, they're not
optimized for weight. But I think what you're getting at is if you're going to compare, let's say, the Bison to something else, you do need to say, you're only going to compare it if you were going to add those things. Otherwise, you wouldn't be looking at the Bison. You'd be looking at maybe a ZR2 or a High Country or something.
Sure.
And so, if you're looking at, even a Ranger Raptor or something like that, a TRD Pro, that's really more compared to the stock ZR2 or the High Country. And it is one of those things where payload is just a funny thing. So you really have to compare apples to apples, because if you're looking at the Bison, that means you're planning on adding all those things. And if you're going to add all those things to either, any of those other trucks, you have to start subtracting all that weight out.
Sure.
And so, if you really look apples to apples, the Bison's actually pretty good in terms of payload. But one of the things I think is worth mentioning is just kind of like, where does this payload number come from? Because it's a bit nebulous, really. It's not there's very few tests on the OE side that are required by the government that sets payload. There are some that factor into it, but it's really this big kind of nebulous number that a lot of it's the OE's kind of responsible for making up what they feel comfortable with. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are kind of responsible for safety and their own warranty and things like that. So, again, when you're comparing one manufacturer to another, one might be more conservative than another, right? And so generally the larger companies are more conservative than the smaller companies. And also it just kind of depends on what they feel comfortable with. And there's a lot of factors. I mean, you could be looking at cooling, engine power, braking. And so braking does have some tests. Stability control has some tests that, you need to pass at gross vehicle weight, right? So there's some things that are kind of, like standardized, but even within those, there's a lot of, again, kind of gray area, right? So it's a really hard number to compare apples to apples. And you might look at something and be like, well, this truck has like literally the exact same axle as the competitor truck, yet the gross vehicle weight rating is lower. And you're like, well, why is that? And
a lot of people think it's like axle related or frame related, but there's more to it.
No, they're absolutely axles, frame. I mean, those are just minor
bearing size.
Components. Yeah, bearing size. But I mean, like the Chevy and the Ram have essentially the same rear axle, yet they have different numbers, right? And so you start looking at that, and it's a really hard thing to compare apples to apples. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what does that manufacturer feel comfortable with, pass all the government tests and their internal tests. And quite often the manufacturers have their internal tests are stricter, like when it comes to crash, when it comes to braking requirements. There's like a government required test, but almost all the manufacturers tend to try and beat that, and they have like their own internal ratings. And so a lot of manufacturers aim to be, like whatever you could call it, like 5 stars, even though maybe it's only 3 to pass the government test. A lot of the manufacturers, their internal tests are higher. But then if they get to something where they're like, well, we need a little more here, then they can, they can go to their leadership and start say, hey, we want to do this and we want to reduce this down to a 4-star rating. It's still better than the government requirement, but, maybe in consumer reports, we won't get as good a score here. Sure. So then it gets, it almost gets into the marketing talks. There's a lot of give and take, and those marketing numbers are really critical because, unfortunately, especially with journalists, they're handed a sheet of paper and they're looking at numbers. And I always think it's funny, like approach angle, 24.1. Well, maybe this truck beats it by 24.2. Yeah, right. Sure. And like you guys know, like is that ever going to affect a consumer? Never. No. Absolutely not. But all of a sudden, it ranks this truck higher than this truck. So
there's a lot of journalists that rewrite press releases.
Well, and yeah, I mean, that's true. But even the marketing teams at the companies, right, they have to have these numbers. Yeah. And whether it's like, I mean, if you put a winch on almost any truck, and Jeeps are excluded because of how they're mounted. But like, let's say a typical truck, like a Toyota, a Chevy Bison, a Chevy mid-size truck, a full-size truck, whether it's one of our bumpers or an aftermarket bumper, you're almost always reducing the approach angle.
Yeah.
Just because you have to fit a winch in there and it has to stick out so far, and that's just kind of a fact. Now, does that make the truck worse off-road?
Yeah.
Well, no, because you're generally putting a better bumper on and a system, and you've got a winch on the front, so it actually makes it better. But does the consumer care that their approach went from 24.1 to a slightly less number?
Sure.
and does it really affect the consumer? No, it doesn't.
One thing I also found interesting, because I have talked with a bunch of engineers at the various OEMs about payload, because it's something that we feel is important. And what one of them shared with me is that they will test just like a standard vehicle. So they'll say like maybe they're mid-grade. They do all of these tests. And then if there's anything that's above the mid-grade, all they do is just take what the extra accessories weigh, and they just reduce it off that number to lower their expenses. Whereas I suspect, like especially with the fact that a Bison is wider and there's additional considerations around the Multimatic suspension, the jounces, all of those things that would help it handle payload better. Maybe, and I don't know if GM does this, but it seems like a lot of them, they'll just take whatever the accessories weigh and they just remove it from that baseline number.
Yeah, and so again, I can talk about past programs. So like the original Bison, we actually were able to retest and re-rate it at the same number as that generic vehicle, even though it did have more weight. I think we were about 200 pounds heavier.
Sure.
But we re-ran the test and everything worked out okay. And you're right. So that's another example of like apples to apples, right? I mean, if you look on paper, a Dodge Ram, or not a Dodge, still call it Dodge, but a Ram single cab, long box diesel is rated for way more than a long wheelbase dually.
Yeah.
Right? And so you're kind of like, which one would you rather tow with?
Yeah, sure.
Of course, you'd much rather tow with the dually and have some redundancy there. But it's not rated as high as the single cab, shorter wheelbase truck.
Because single cabs are awesome.
Single cabs are awesome, but again, looking at the numbers, it's
Sure.
like, what do you want to tow? And it also depends a lot on what you're towing. Boats are totally different than excavators per se, because of where the weight is. But payload is just one of those things where it's a really it's not a clear-cut number, and you kind of look at like the trucks in other markets where the speeds aren't as great, basically rest of the world, right? You can have a little tiny truck that's capable of carrying a ton of payload.
Yeah.
Like a literal ton of payload. And it's
Sure.
a little tiny truck with little tiny, like almost golf cart axles. And you're like, how does that work? Well, it's because, they feel comfortable with it at 35 miles an hour.
Right.
It's a lot different than here in the States where you can tow and you can tow high speeds for long distances.
Yeah, if you go through Utah towing a trailer, you can be doing 80 miles an hour.
Yeah, to the point where, the trailer tires, almost no trailer tires can handle that in the heat. And these trucks are so powerful nowadays, they don't notice it, right? You literally can tow, 18, 20,000 pounds at 85 miles an hour and way exceed the trailer tire, almost all trailer tires, right?
Well, so in your mind, what are, when you look at the payload, like let's take a mid-size, for example, what should people be mindful of around payload? Do you care more about where the load is placed, or are there things that make you less concerned around payload? How do you look at it?
In general, like there's a good rule of thumb that if you're at 80% of the payload capacity or the gross vehicle weight, if you're at 80%, the vehicle is generally going to perform well. Now, if you took, all that weight and put it way up high, that's not going to perform that well.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there's common sense, right? If you keep the weight down low and keep it in the center, and try and, I always recommend people put their truck on a scale and really see, because there's a lot of 7,000 pound Wranglers around.
Oh yeah.
Right. I mean, just way over, I can't recommend it, but they work fine.
Yeah.
They don't drive particularly awesome, but they work, and they're probably safe to drive, but you don't know. But especially when you're exceeding it by that much, I mean, it can really have dramatic results. So, on the Wranglers and the smaller trucks, it's really easy to exceed gross vehicle weight, payload. I mean, because they are relatively low, they don't have a lot of overhead. When you get into the heavier trucks, you have a lot of overhead. And sometimes that's a problem because you can get, crazy amounts of weight, Matt,
Yeah.
you can get absolutely crazy amounts of weight. And again, but that 80% rule still kind of translates well, right? If you can be at 80% or under of what the truck's rated at, you're going to have a pretty good performing machine.
Yeah, so maybe that's more of it is trying to strike the balance between safety, technical terrain performance, economy, longevity of the platform. When you start really, really pushing it, that's when you see the bent frames and you see the, it's pretty shocking recently there's some heavy vehicles out there.
We were talking about the Earthroamer stuff, and they're a 19.5 chassis. And the dirty little secret on those is you now have to pretty much replace the wheel bearings every 30,000 miles because guys are spinning bearings and axles and having big issues and having to upgrade frames because there's a lot of frames that are cracking, and they're not following that kind of 80-20.
No. And that goes for almost that whole side of the industry. Now, I
Yeah.
wouldn't pick on Earthroamer in particular, but, all of those trucks tend to be, there's a lot of things that people don't look at. And, if you want to talk heavy duty trucks, all the manufacturers give you guidance on the cab chassis, how you're supposed to mount something, how you're supposed to avoid stress risers, which is a localized spot in the frame that would really, like maybe you have a mount on the frame, and you see this a lot with like a lot of those bent frame trucks that you see,
Yeah.
That's right where the camper tied in. And so they're picking on that point all the time and they're working it. And those cab chassis trucks, they have hardened steel frames. So it's a bit different than, it's totally different than a pickup truck, right? That's another thing. People don't realize cab chassis trucks, they basically share the same cab, but it's a different motor. Like you don't think the motor's like a Cummins motor is different, but it's different there's actually different hard parts in the motor. The suspension's different. The axles are different. The frames are different. The cab is the same, and that's about it.
Yeah. And a lot of times the frames are just straight right out
they're a
of the cab.
C-channel
Yeah.
They're straight and they're C-channel, but they are hardened, so you don't want to weld on them, and you want to really, adhere to those rules. But the problem is those rules are designed for box trucks. They're designed for utility trucks. They're designed for rollbacks. And so when you get into like an off-road camper situation, then you're kind of playing in gray area, right? And so a lot of these companies have tried to, resolve that. But you're right, Matt, the big dirty secret is a lot of these trucks, if you look at them and you talk to even the journalists, they don't really understand quite often that just because a truck had a 19.5 payload, 19.5 gross vehicle weight, they got it. And before they even put their camper on, they put 40-inch tires on it, 41-inch tires, heavy military tires, a lot of them. Heavy wheels.
Yeah.
Yep. So all that should be reducing the payload capacity.
230 pounds of rotating mass
Yeah.
for an
and they
MPT.
drive,
and a
and
beadlock.
those wheels drive surprisingly well, right? We just started offering a 5500, and we do offer those tires. It's shocking how well they actually drive. But, again, as like a rule of thumb, if you're going to go from a 34-inch tire to a 40-inch tire, what is that? It's somewhere in the 80%. You should be reducing your payload right there by about 80%. So, guess what number that falls in line with?
Yeah.
And so, again, if you can be at 80% of the gross vehicle weight, once you put those tires on, now you're kind of at your limit, but it's still going to perform well.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how that Pareto principle applies to everything, including payload.
Yeah,
80-20 rule.
Again, it's a rule of thumb, but I would say if you're gonna, if you take your tire size and divide those two numbers and get your percentage, that's about what you should be reducing the gross vehicle weight rating. And so the aftermarket, they've got this. They buy this truck. It's got 19.5 on the sticker. They put 41-inch tires on it, and even if they're not selling a truck or they're not selling a camper or something, they're just selling a truck or whatever it might be for utility, they still are advertising 19.5, and it's not, right? It shouldn't be, and that's something the aftermarket doesn't really. It's kind of like a gray area where they, they don't. They'll let you think that it still has a 19.5 GVW when really it should be reduced. Like if the OEM was putting 41-inch tires on it, they would be reducing that gross vehicle weight because of, whether it's the the leverage on the axles, and a lot of times they do have a more offset wheel, which stresses your wheel bearings. But the axle diameter itself, the drive shaft diameters, I mean, all the way into the transmission, all those gears, I mean, that's a lot of added leverage. So you really, they were never tested for 41-inch tires. I mean, it's basically like having a huge trailer on all the time, just putting the tires on, right?
Even the rolling resistance, no everything.
Yeah, and just all the added leverage is the big one.
And I think that makes it even more interesting around like the Bison, for example, the fact that this mid-sized truck is coming from the factory with a 35-inch tall tire, and it still is close enough to 1,000 pounds of payload. If I remember, it's right around 1,000 pounds of payload. So the fact that it should be reduced a lot, and the fact that they can keep it as high as they are from the OEM is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and again, I can't talk current stuff, but like on the past program, the past Bison, the original Bison, we wanted to do larger tires, right? I mean, everybody's like, oh, you should have put larger tires on it. Well, there's reasons we couldn't, right? And on the second gen, we did get that 35-inch tire on there because we were able to do things downstream and early on to enable those. But one of the things that you kind of think about was, like, I remember a specific conversation where it was like the transfer case chain didn't have enough torque capacity for a 35-inch tire.
Sure.
And so we would have had to make the chain wider, which would have meant a new transfer case. And then you start getting into these conversations where it's like, okay, how much does it cost to retool a transfer case? Well, it's not cheap, I can tell you that, right? And then it comes down to, well, how many of these trucks are we building? What do we think our failure rate is? How many does that translate into on the warranty side? Do we just let them go and those 600 people we end up replacing their transfer case?
Got it.
Right? I mean, you get into conversations like that where it's like, you could do this, but at the end of the day, GM said, no, we don't want the headache. We're just gonna, there were other reasons, right, why we couldn't put a bigger tire on. But it's interesting behind closed doors. It's like, what is that limiting factor? And it may not always be what you think it is.
Yeah, I'd never even considered something I'm going to say as trivial as that.
Yeah, and you wouldn't think like the transfer case chain. Like, who's ever broken a transfer case chain?
Yeah.
I never have.
Yeah, no, I haven't for sure.
And is that something that could be alleviated from re-gearing? Because there's so much kind of, at least on the enthusiast side, the thought that once you re-gear your axles for the appropriate size tire, it kind of keeps things all in line.
Yeah, it does and it doesn't, right? It keeps the engine in its power band. It does help with some gear strength, but not always, because as you get, lower gear, you're generally getting a smaller pinion.
Yeah.
You get smaller size on one side, and the same goes, it goes all the way upstream, right? So it's never, and it could be cooling, right? It could be the cooling issues, but you do get into those conversations where it's, okay, what is this going to be, and what's it going to mean for warranty, and what's, are we going to actually, we can't strand a customer, right? That's a no-go.
Yeah.
Can the truck handle more weight? Yeah, it could, but it kind of depends. And when we're engineering it, we have to kind of pick a common denominator and say, well, the person's going to have 600 pounds and it's going to be 24 inches off the floor, right? So when we do our stability control testing, like on a Wrangler, I remember like doing the Gladiator, and I think it was 600 pounds and it was 24 inches off the bed off the floor of the bed, right? So there's like these specific numbers, but does that mean it's going to work when somebody puts a camper in and it's got a way higher center of gravity and they put the tire on the roof or whatever it might be, right? So we're trying to kind of figure out worst case scenario, but not an extreme. I mean, we can't figure out. I mean, there's people who are going to do crazy things all the time, and we can't plan for that.
Yeah.
But you can do your best, and so we try and do really, realistic worst case scenarios, right, for most consumers. And because, again, like the name of the game is, you never want to strand somebody, and cars for the most part these days don't, they might have glitches, they might do this, they might do that, but
pretty dang reliable.
It's pretty rare that they strand anybody.
I have never been stranded. Well, that's not true. I broke an axle once and I had to sleep in my truck before I hiked out one time in snow, but that was my fault too. I was I deserved it. I'll say that. But, I've never had a truck really stop running on me or do anything like that.
Yeah, I haven't either. I mean, which is crazy. You think about all the miles we do.
I've had old stuff like vapor lock, but
then it cools down and you restart it or whatever. And a special thanks to O3 Outdoors for their support of this week's podcast. The world is messy. That's the price every outdoorsman pays for adventure. So when we need to keep things fresh, well, we at O3 Outdoors don't do things halfway. We turn to the same technology NASA used to clean the space station, and we bring it down to our own frontier. You know, the smells, sweat, smoke, and fuel, the smells of a proper adventure, the stuff a true outdoorsman knows firsthand. Our technology here at O3 Outdoors eliminates bacteria and odors on gear or in your home and in your vehicles. Our Trekker bags allow you to pack, store, and carry your gear, cleaning it the entire time. Our portable Overlander units fit in any vehicle, home, or RV. It's the highest tech brought to the outdoor experience. Keep your gear fresh from one frontier to another. Thanks, O3 Outdoors. And I guess that makes it even more impressive to see a mid-sized truck with 35s, because the decisions and how strong the base platform must be just to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's funny too. There's an issue like with the Colorado, going back to frame strength and stress risers and point loading. The race truck had a really nice cage built in it, and they literally bent the frame right where but if you look at it, it's right where you kind of had. In hindsight, it was obvious. Early on, it's like looks great, right?
You're stiffening one portion and then
you get it too
the
stiff,
rest.
right? And then you repeat it, and that truck still finished the race even with a bent frame. But it's same thing with these big campers. These you see these massive slide-in campers.
Yeah.
I forget some of the name brands.
Yeah, like a Lance or something like that.
Yeah, Lance. They're like 5,000 pounds.
Yeah.
They're way over a GVW of a 3,500 truck.
Yeah.
When the way they tie them to the frame and the way they rock, and especially you get those frames beaming going down the road, and then you put a motorcycle on the back or something, and it's beaming even more, and it just keeps flexing right in one specific point. So if it's kind of interesting. If you ever look online, you can go. I'm sure Ford has it. I know Ram and Chevy do. But you can go to what they call the bodybuilder's guide, and you can see actually how to mount to a frame. And so a lot of them will have a wood or plastic. Like a piece in between the body that you're putting on and the frame, and at the end they'll taper it. And so they taper it so that as that frame twists, it's never stressing in one spot. If they just took that wood or plastic isolator and just cut it straight off, it would put all the load right in that one point.
That makes sense.
And so eventually it would crack through the web. So there is a lot of engineering available online that the factories have already done. And I see it, in the industrial side, in the telephone equipment bodies, rollbacks. I see that stuff being adhered to. When I get into our industry, in the Overland industry, I don't see it. I see a lot of people take like the Mercedes 3-point frames and they think, oh, this works on the Mercedes. This should work on a Ford or a Ram or Chevy. And it doesn't, right?
Not
The
necessarily.
frames are completely different. The way they flex is completely different. The stress risers are completely different. So, what works on a military truck is putting a lot of stress because, if you have 3 points, if you look at it from the side, you really only have 2, and your whole camper's held on 2 points, and it puts a lot of load in the specific places. And then so I do see a lot of companies chasing frame problems.
Well, and how long
not
those are.
any oversight on this kind of stuff.
No.
The RV industry has some, right? There's
Minimal.
RVIA,
Yeah, pretty
which
minimal.
is maybe just means it's
They're just keeping it from
wood.
blowing up. Yeah.
Yeah,
With propane.
very minimal stuff. But it's still so early,
Yeah.
and and people are spending a lot of money on these things.
They spend a lot of money on there will be some buyer's remorse, right? A lot of people aren't going to say oh, that was a bad decision.
Yeah.
I do have a lot of problems. This broke, that broke.
A lot of people just won't say that they have problems because
They're
so much money.
it's
Right.
confirmation bias. They want to make sure that their big purchase still looks good.
Well, I mean,
it's human nature.
Yeah,
with
of course.
the,
Yeah, of course.
like the big expedition stuff, we're finally starting to see more of like the international chassis, like what Spencer's doing with a lot of things with Bliss Mobile is kind of the right direction, you know?
Yeah, and he's one that he's got a really nice subframe. There are some things changing. Spencer's got a nice subframe. I've seen what the guys at TruckHouse are doing. It's super nice.
And you're kind of involved in the TruckHouse on like a consultant design level?
Yeah.
Or just enthusiastic about it?
Both.
Yeah.
Those guys, when I saw what they did, not so much with the Toyota, because I was like, how's that going to handle it?
And everybody wanted what they built on the Toyota.
Yep. It was a good idea.
On a full size chassis.
Well, even the Toyota, I thought was a good idea. Like if you just look at it on paper, it was a good idea because that space wasn't taken. Right. The smaller, I can park it in a parking lot.
Right.
Not a 84 or 111 inch cab chassis. I mean, it's a smaller.
Yeah, the old Sunraider that everybody wanted.
Sunraider, which is how they got going. Right. But when I saw the quality of the camper they were building with the carbon and the foam core and the way they were doing it, I'll tell you, I haven't been impressed. Our industry was, I haven't been that impressed with anybody really in almost my whole career. I mean, they really know what they're doing with the composites end of it. So,
and they're so passionate about it.
Yeah, they're great.
Anytime I've ever talked to them, those guys are great.
Yep, they are. And so
high praise.
What we did with them is they decided, okay, we're going to use your chassis, because I approached them. I say, hey, this camper's awesome, but you should consider a higher chassis. And they were like, it wasn't a hard sell, right?
Yeah.
They kind of knew after doing it the hard way, right? And so then it got into, maybe some consulting on how to mount it, and then also how to. We did a lot of the exterior styling.
Yeah, it has those like not aerofoils or whatever
to reduce the buffeting down the sides, and just some strength and a lot of crown. It's a really sophisticated surface. It you might look at it and say, oh, it's it looks like another camper, but I'm sure when you see it in person, you're going to see all the crown and the tumble home, and it's a really sophisticated surface done by automotive designers.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
And so it's different than what's in the industry. It's subtle, but it's different, and
still looks good.
Yeah, and the way they build it, they're actually machining both. They're like 5-axis machining the CNC core, or 5-axis CNC machining the core, right? So the core is a 2-inch thick, like really highly specialized foam core that they're packing it between 2 layers of carbon, and it ends up being like a giant Yeti cooler. But I mean, there's nobody who would CNC machine all the foam.
Because they're kind of a high-end marine background, right?
Yeah. So they're doing some interesting things over there, and I've seen some of the early parts, and it's kind of mind blowing.
And it looks really good too.
Do they have like a launch date on that?
Yeah, I've talked to him a couple
times.
I've talked to him a couple times, but that's a hard job. It's gonna take twice as long and cost twice as much.
It will, but I think what those guys have going
job
for them is it's the quality of that shell is unmatched. I mean, you have somebody like Spencer and the Bliss Mobile, which I think are unbelievable.
Different concept,
but it's
that concept is you have the asset that you can then move to another truck when it wears out.
It's totally different. Yep. Yeah, it's totally different. And these guys are going. I think Spencer's smallest is with the 84-inch.
Yeah.
These guys are focusing on 2 things. One, it's interesting. It's a 3500 because they can do the weight, and it's a 60-inch cab to axle. So it's basically a 2-door long bed or a 4-door long bed.
Really maneuverable with that
it's a
high steer axle.
Normal truck. Now,
no, it doesn't have the high steer.
It doesn't. No. Yeah. So that's the disadvantage of the 3500. It doesn't have the high steer axle, but it does have the ability to put locking diffs in. And they'll be able to do a 5500, which does have the high steer, but then you can't do the locking diffs. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah.
But I think, and we're doing those 5500 chassis now for both those guys.
And can anybody just buy those?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and that's a whole nother conversation how that came about. But that's an interesting one too. But it's really interesting on the 3500 because their camper is so lightweight that they're at that 80% rule even with just a 3500.
Wow. And how much water are they gonna have on board?
I'm not sure. I think it's like 40 gallons.
Oh, okay.
It's not like full earth roamer numbers,
right.
But I think it's
they're paying attention to weight.
You could definitely take that a lot more places. You know, you talk about that beaming thing, which is a term that I learned from you, Scott, which you learned
That's right.
from Dave.
That's where I learned it from.
Like you feel that on these large trucks.
Oh, beaming, yeah.
Yeah, and
it's physics, right? You're not going to stop it.
well, it's that. What is this like weird like wave going through my chassis? And,
Yep.
You know, it's a big limiting factor to where you can take the thing.
Which leads me to a question. We're seeing more trucks coming out with rear coil sprung solid axle suspensions. So the aft component of that frame is now no longer supported by a rear shackle and a leaf spring. So one of the advantages of the leaf spring is putting the weight onto those 2 points. What are your thoughts around the coil sprung rear suspensions? Do you think it's a good thing? Or have they figured out how to make the frame strong enough?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing. Like if you take, and I know Toyota has a coil spring now, but let's just say Ram because I know that better. But the Ram frame on let's say a 2500 pickup is so much stiffer than like a 3500 cab chassis. Like a 3500 cab chassis will twist like you won't believe.
Got it.
I mean, so mounting to it for off-road use can really be a challenge. On the other hand, you have this really stiff suspension, or can be stiff to handle a lot of load, but you can still get good articulation.
Right.
Whereas a 2500, that frame is just like monumentally stiffer than a cab chassis. So you could like rigid mount it camper onto a 2500. Like Clay's got one, right?
Yep.
He's got his flatbed and then a 4-wheel camper, and he's used it and there's no issues. And that's because, and granted, his is a 3500 with air, but even the 3500 pickup frame is monumentally stiffer than a cab chassis frame. And so you don't get a lot of the beaming, and that has to do with wheelbase too, a lot of that. But it puts a lot more load into the suspension and takes it away from the frame.
Yeah.
But you're right, it only puts it in the 1 point.
Yep.
And so, I mean, take a look at a Ram 2500 frame, it's really stout. I mean, unbelievably stout, and it's engineered for it. And they were able to do some really unique things with geometry on that to make it stable, even though the springs are relatively narrow.
Yeah.
That truck works well. And I'm assuming...
I'm impressed by it. We had a Rebel with the rear locker and the coil sprung rear.
The 2500.
Yeah, the 2500 just a couple weeks ago. And I got it fully articulated where wheels were off the ground, and the gaps, the bed gap to the body, you couldn't tell that it was twisting.
Minimal, right?
Almost imperceptible, which normally full-size trucks, like if you look at a Tremor or whatever, there's a lot of flex.
Yeah, yep. So with leaf springs, there's a lot of tricks that you can do, and you're taking a lot of it up with a spring and a stiffer frame.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that Toyota's probably similar.
Yeah.
We've talked about a lot with other trucks. One of the big...
Or Gladiators, I just worry about, you see a lot of big campers on Gladiators because they have a 1,700 pound payload in certain configurations.
Yep.
That's got to be a lot of weight.
So, and some of that's geometry, right? So Gladiator basically shares a lot of the rear suspension with a 1500 Ram. In fact, all the actual components are carryover, but geometry is a little bit different. But they were smart when they did the Gladiator. They didn't just take the Wrangler suspension, put it back there. They re-engineered that whole rear suspension so it can handle some weight. And I don't have a lot of experience with Gladiator with a lot of weight because I've never built one up for myself. So I don't know, but I imagine they work pretty decent.
Yeah, it was always something I worry about.
I had one. The only funky thing with the Gladiator doing a kind of a camper build is that the front of the bed was attached with like hydraulic mounts. So I
think it's the back of the cab has those.
Is it the back of the cab?
Yeah,
I thought it was the
back
front
of the cab.
Either way, it would flex so much. The chassis wasn't flexing. It was actually the camper itself would move so much. I had maybe 2 or 3 inches of clearance, maybe more, between the roof and the AT Summit. And if you like sent it over something, it would smack. Like the first time it smacked, I was like, "What in the hay?"
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, that's another. If we go back to that bodybuilder's guide, and granted, there's not one for a Gladiator, but all those dimensions are in the bodybuilder guide. So there should be a 3-inch gap between the back of the cab and a camper. Same on the roof. They have a lot of those dimensions are, there's got to be 8 inches. I think it's 8.5 on a ram, from the top of the tire to the top of whatever's above it.
Right.
And I see a lot of flatbeds that aren't even close to that.
Not even close.
But it's interesting. There's so much free information out there that can be, adhered to, or like how to cut the back of the cab out. Right. And you don't see hardly anybody in our industry, I don't think, has ever read that, because, it clearly states how you're supposed to do it. And I rarely see it done, they have those specs for ambulances and things like that. But there's a wealth of resource on the internet with those bodybuilder guides that, people should try to adhere to.
And you've really helped me look at the full-size domestic pickups very different. I mean, when you talked just even a few years ago, we were having a conversation about like the headroom that they build into those trucks for handling heat and towing, and people that are going to overload them and payload. I mean, it definitely changed my view on how durable those trucks are. And then, of course, when we were able to drive them up to Tuktoyaktuk and just, traveling in them, I'm like, it changed my view on full size for sure.
Yeah, they're pretty comfortable.
Well, they're not that much bigger, particularly like the Ram stuff, even with the quad cab and the short bed, they're only a couple inches bigger than like a Gladiator. That was what killed my Gladiator for me, as I went to the dealer for service or something, and I parked next to a 2500. And I kind of did a double take as I walked back. I'm like, they were basically the same size.
Yeah, and that's true, especially if you look at footprint, the silhouette footprint.
Yeah. The
difference is, because the Gladiator and Jeeps inherently, they have the tires sticking out.
Yeah.
The wheels stick out. So, yes, they are the same, quote unquote, or I'll just say approximately the same width.
Yeah.
The difference is the body's so much narrower. So when you do get them in off-road situations, just inherently they're so much better than, a mid-size or a full-size, because they're tucked in, right?
And that's what I like about it. I mean, as I'm trying to decide what is the next vehicle that I want to build, I'm stuck between like wanting to go with a Gladiator because of the capability.
Yeah,
like
but I don't think you end up using it when you commit to like the camper route with a Gladiator.
I don't know. When I took that AT4 on Hell's Revenge, like I want to do that stuff.
Yeah,
I like pushing the platforms.
Getting a full-size
I enjoy it.
truck in those, you can, I've taken full-size trucks in all kinds of spots, and, you just have to learn to like use the whole trail.
Yeah.
And they generally will go, and they'll generally go, unless there's some big hard rock stopping it from fitting, it's going to go.
If it fits, it gets.
Yeah. It's just like, you have to learn to use every inch of the trail.
Yeah.
And so that can get to be a challenge. And what I find is that the biggest challenge with campers is the height.
Yeah.
To me, like even in my little Jeep camper, the Outpost, it's always like the height is really the only thing that's ever like turned me around.
And you even had angles on the sides so you can make it a little more.
And like when we did the styling for the TruckHouse, we actually did a rub rail, so you can lean it over into trees or rocks into a easily repairable. It's a steel rail, but repairable in terms of like touch-up paint.
Sure.
But it's set up with rub rail, so you can tip it into stuff and not really worry about it.
It was pretty crazy, the stuff I would rub that Scout up against. Like, it was shocking how well it held up to that. It definitely it reframed my understanding of just how appropriate full-size trucks are. And also, most of the agencies, the BLM and the Forest Service, they all drive full-size trucks around on those trails.
And that's true from here to South America, right? And all the governments are using half-ton or full-size trucks, from here all the way to South America. So you generally find that most places, unless you're really trying to do like Moab type trails,
right?
For the most part, you can do 85-90% of any trail with a full-size truck. It's just you have to learn how to drive it. And then there are disadvantages, but for most people, the advantages of having that added headroom of capability and just the general comfort, like when you do get on the highway and you want to go someplace,
it's pretty shocking how comfortable they are.
And you set the cruise at 80 and you've got 1,000 pound-feet of torque in all these new trucks. It's pretty mind-blowing how easy it is. And frankly, on a lot of these, like I know the guys at TruckHouse, when they were dealing with their weight numbers, if you really look at their weight, I mean, you can still tow a Mastercraft or something. I mean, you can still tow toys and still have the capability because their weight is so low.
Yeah.
Which is pretty awesome, and the truck's not even know it's there.
And now you're not looking just at Ram and Tremor from Ford, but now GMC and Chevrolet has their HDs with a rear locker. They've gotten rid of that G80 and some of the specs, which is a really, I think having a driver selectable locker is a key thing. Mm-hmm. But then you've also got the only heavy duty truck with independent front suspension, and they nailed it with having the Multimatic suspension with independent on a truck with, the one that I was driving, which had all of your stuff on it, like all the metal bumpers, 35s and everything else. It still had a 2,600 pound payload, and it had all of the stuff on it.
Yeah, and I think it can tow 18,000
pounds. So
yeah.
What was interesting to me was, because like a Tremor, for example, it's very capable. I like the look of the Ford, but it is abusive on the trail when it's not heavily loaded. Yeah. So even if you were to put like a standard camper in the back, it's an abusive ride quality. The Ram's a little bit better in stock form. I'm talking about stock vehicles.
Yeah.
But the 35-inch tall tires with the Multimatic and the independent front, it was actually fun to wheel the GMC.
Yeah, and I think with the 35, somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the tire pressure is max tire pressure, I think, is 60, 65, something like that. So, if you're not loaded, you can run it less. And so when you get these bigger tires on and you can run lower pressures, they instantly become less abusive. And then you combine that with a Multimatic shock and a little bit of weight in the back, and they're pretty comfortable. And that independent suspension definitely has some advantages, and that's something people always ask me, which is better, which do I like more? And it's they're all good trucks.
Yeah.
Every single one of them is an amazing truck, and they all have good things. And and there's so few bad things. You just kind of have to pick which one you like and which one works for your mission better.
Yeah, and also just acknowledging that you'll hear people complain that a Tremor doesn't come with a front locker, and it's 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. Some buyer
1,200 now, I think.
Yeah. Some buyer is going to get onto the trail, they're going to go full lock to the left, and they're going to lock that front diff, and it is going to explode no matter how big the diff is. So that's why they don't do that. They don't put it.
And that's why, besides sales, that's a big advantage of having automatic transmissions is they can reduce that.
Yeah.
Right. So just because a truck says it has 1,000 or 1,200, it doesn't mean you get it. So if you're
can it adjust even if you're in 4 low, and does it know the main shaft angle of the steering wheel? Does it?
They know everything.
Oh, so they could even back it off to make sure.
They know how much your passenger weighs. They're sensors for every little thing in that truck, and they're going around on that CAN bus, hundreds of thousands of messages, within seconds. They know everything at every time. So yeah, they can definitely do things. They could
to preserve.
I don't know if they do because I haven't. I don't know that particular software, but they can absolutely manage the torque in a number of situations. If you're in 4 low, 4 high,
diff lock, diff not
depending
lock.
what temperatures are, horsepower equals heat, right? Horsepower and BTUs are one and the same. So they can definitely do all that stuff.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, they can reduce torque on so many different things. And so it is an advantage for them to have these automatic transmissions because they can start you out in second, for instance.
Yeah.
They can do any number of things.
Yeah, don't they derate the
it.
throttle on a lot of the full-size trucks in first gear?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because otherwise you just smoke those tires. They just absolutely
these
light them up.
transmissions with the 8 speeds or 10 speeds, the first gear is generally pretty low.
Yeah.
It was interesting because I had the stock 2500, and then I had the 2500 Prospector XL immediately after it. And that right turn that we have to make?
Yeah.
Okay, there's always gravel there.
Oh, yeah.
I could not get the stock 2500 to hook up at all. It would just sit there and spin. I had to have so much room to get going every time. And the Prospector, I think, just maybe a little bit bigger tires at the time. You couldn't re-gear them. just hooked up and I could go.
Well, and you have a bigger footprint and you have softer, lower pressure. I mean, that stuff, it all makes differences.
Yeah.
One of the things I see with Ram guys all the time is they'll put a light bar. There's this perfect hole in the front bumper. And in anything 13 or newer, they move the intercooler down there, and that is your intercooler air. And on the 12 and earlier trucks, you could put a light bar in this perfect hole in the bumper, and it looks really cool, and it's all curved, and it looks really ideal. But I still see it today. On anything 13 and newer, you're basically just reducing your
horsepower
drastically.
Yeah.
Right. And so people don't understand that, and it doesn't really set a warning unless it's really, really bad. It doesn't set a warning, but it just starts derating power. So then, of course, these same guys will go and they're like, oh, this thing needs more power.
So they do banks or whatever.
Yeah, and some of the bank stuff is really good. They do some real engineering, but a lot of the stuff is it'll take away certain safeties, and then then they start unraveling the sweater, right? Taking that thread and unraveling it, and so it's one thing after another, and all of a sudden they're wondering why their number 6 cylinder went out.
Well, and that's a perfect segue into one of the things that we wanted to talk about, which is the advantage of buying an OEM, high performance model, is because all of that stuff is taken into consideration. In the ways that you can talk about it, like help the listener understand what is the advantage of buying a high performance package from an OEM as opposed to just building it yourself. What are some of the disadvantages too, maybe?
Let's see. Disadvantages on the surface would be cost, because you're having to buy it all at once, and it can definitely seem expensive, right? Because I think all of us as humans, we kid ourselves on what something actually costs when we start modifying it and chasing down this and that and the other thing, and and a lot of it we conveniently forget about. Right? A lot of those costs we conveniently forget about. So in terms of disadvantages, I would say that's the number one thing. And then as a number two, it's like maybe you have a special mission that's different. Maybe you want to do something different. Because as an aftermarket company, when we're working with the OEM, we are aiming for, the 99% distribution. We don't have the ends, right, of that. We have a standard deviation, right?
Sure.
We don't have the ends of that. So, there are customers that what we build may not work for them. Yeah. Right. And
so highly specialized scenarios. Yeah.
Yeah. Highly specialized, or, and some of it's opinion, right? I mean, keep in mind our AEV's typical customer, like let's say with a Wrangler, is somebody who's already tried to build 3 Wranglers. Yeah. At least, typically it's 3. And at this point they're like, I don't want to play with it.
I want it to work.
And I don't want to turn wrenches. I just want it to.
Yeah. It's 3.
Exactly. Yeah.
True.
And so, and that's, and that's our typical customer.
Sure.
Right? They've been there, done that. Now they just want to use the car, because there's a hobby in itself of modifying the car and seeing what works and what doesn't. And then
which can be fun in and of itself. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then there's also, I want something with all the factory engineering that just works.
And a warranty. And for a lot of people, that they can get a lower interest rate on the total vehicle as opposed to what they would pay for their credit card bill if they were buying winches and bumpers and stuff.
I think there's also, just as somebody who's learned this the hard way, there's also the time cost, I think, of my Gladiator, for example, was all AEV outfitted, but I had to deal with all of that. And if I added up what I spent at the local four-wheel drive shop at, depending where you are in the country, that's between $125 to $200 an hour for that labor cost. And then your time and effort of having to pick this thing up. And granted, it was a fun project. Yeah. But just, maybe it's from a place of privilege, but just being able to write the check and being done with it, I was able to enjoy that vehicle from day one versus having to have this build process over.
You mean when you had the Prospector, you were just able to enjoy it?
I was just able to enjoy it, and it was done.
Yeah, and I would say it's easier to talk about the advantages, because the advantages to a consumer is you get an amount of engineering. Like when we do something with the OE, it even surpasses like what we would normally do as AEV, because we have all these internal, what I'll call customers within GM or Jeep or Chrysler, whatever. we have these internal customers that we have to answer to, right? So you have to, like these aftermarket bumpers that you may go buy, they definitely haven't been through crash. They definitely haven't been through cooling testing. They definitely haven't been through modal, which is like the frequency that it resonates at and can cause major problems with, frame cracking and just performance in general. They definitely haven't been through corrosion testing, all these things, sensors. I mean, especially it's getting more and more as we go on in the future with all this autonomous driving and the sensor packs required. I mean, you may have three radars. You'll have 6 ultrasonic sensors. You may have, 3 cameras up front. I mean, this is just like average stuff.
Wow.
I mean, average sensor pack is getting pretty extreme. And then you're trying to, guess what? Those sensors want to be right where your winch is, right where your tow hooks are.
Yeah, and so many people are just like, oh, I don't care about that stuff. But it's actually really nice to have.
Well, it is
and
nice to have.
And there's more than just the active cruise control that people think it is as well.
Yeah, but, also as a consumer, I mean, you could be held liable, like with this autonomous driving, if you go modify it. And it's not up to standards. Rear park sensors, do they work in aftermarket bumpers? Yeah, they do. Have they been tested? Do they really meet the criteria? No, they just don't set a code and that work. That's most of the aftermarket says, okay, well that works.
Yeah.
It doesn't really meet the actual like government stated criteria, which there is. We're always having to deal with that. I mean, block heater plugs. I mean, there's
the block heater plug that's on the 2500 HD. It's so cool when it has its own little port and flap and everything.
That isn't the winch controller?
No, it's a block heater plug. Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting, even those, you end up getting a lot more engineering. There's some stuff that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In certain ways, like where does that block heater go, right? That does matter for our internal customers, for the guys putting it on, guys and gals, I should say, putting it on the plant, whether that thing comes in on the bumper, whether it doesn't, can somebody install it? The ergonomics, are they going to get carpal tunnel? Like we have to design around that stuff.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really matter for an end consumer necessarily. But there is a lot of stuff that does matter for the end consumer, like weight, like modal, like cooling, corrosion.
Especially corrosion. I mean,
corrosion's a big one. I mean, we have to provide I guess it's like the equivalent of a 15-year corrosion warranty. So, all that stuff has to go in and get tested. It gets tested with gravel and for creep, and there's all kinds of testing that, the aftermarket couldn't afford to do.
Yeah.
Crash testing is a good one. I mean, I think it's like, and this is going back a number of years, but the last time I saw the numbers, it was like $1 million to set up one test. There's 11 tests required, to meet compliance. And you do that first, and that's like the small portion of it cost-wise. I mean, because we're doing it all in the computer simulated first. And again, I can't talk about current stuff, but on the old stuff, I mean, we could see, like where we have to test for an unbelted passenger, right? So you think about that. It's state law that you have to wear your seatbelt, but we still have to test for unbelted passengers. And we had an issue where like the sun visor, the bumper was going down on an impact because of how it was mounted, and the truck was going up. No, vice versa. I'm sorry, the bumper went up and the truck went down and the unbelted passenger was hitting the sun visor, and it would put load into the neck. And so we had to like readjust how the bumper was mounted so the bumper would go the other direction. The bumper would go down and the truck would go up and clear the guy's head. I mean, so there's stuff like that
you never consider.
And you never consider it. But there's a lot to it, and there's really a lot. And I got to give, a lot of the companies that are trying to do this, the OEMs, a lot of credit, because to do especially like a front bumper takes a lot. I mean, a lot of extra work, and it's not just like, AEV doesn't just show up with this bumper design and give it to GM or Jeep or whoever and say, here you go. I mean, there's thousands of people on those OE side who are putting a lot of effort in engineering and feedback and saying this works with our truck, this doesn't. And it's like, it's a lot of, you should give credit where credit's due. These OEs are really going out of their way
It would be so
to
easy
do
for them
this
to just say no. I mean, you talk $11 million in testing for a bumper with these 11 tests.
Yeah, or you end up with
know,
a size truck without tow hooks on the front because it was probably just easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it is, and so there's a lot of people who are putting a lot of effort into this stuff for the consumer, right? The consumer is the one that really benefits. I mean, yes, these companies are all in competition with each other. They're all in competition for these consumers. So at the end of the day, though, the consumers, I mean, if you just look at the Rubicon, what a boon it's been for on the consumer side that you can buy a vehicle like this, or the new Bison. I mean, speaking of like the new stuff, if you look at the new mid-size Colorado Bison or GMC Canyon, I mean, that thing's nuts. I mean, it's got everything you could have ever asked for. Yeah,
you and I would have thought we like died and went to heaven to get a 35-inch stock, 35s winch, front and rear lockers,
Multimatic bump stops. I mean, that's basically
the bump stops were the big game changer for me.
It's essentially the same suspension Chad Hall's team has been racing for a couple of years, right? And that truck's finished every Best in the Desert series. I mean, that's pretty impressive, and you can go buy it. It's factory lift. It's got bumpers front and rear with steel, and corners, and all the Boron steel skid plates.
Yeah,
and those skid plates. Honestly, that Boron steel is the best material for making skid plates out of. It's
impressive how thin it is for how strong it is.
Yeah, and I've been wanting to figure out how I could afford to make them for for dirt bikes could
you imagine
dual sport bikes?
Yeah,
it slides so well over the rocks. It's so hard. It's a press hardened steel, so it's really hard. So when you slide on it, it doesn't slide like aluminum or plastic. I mean,
where it hangs up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say because those things all gouge, right? And it's like they're second to maybe wood, right? I mean, it's like a terrible material, and steel's too heavy, right? But the Boron steel, it's really.
I remember
it's just such a good material.
at your facility in Michigan, you guys have like Chad Hall's skid plate, differential skid.
Yeah.
I mean, there is not an ounce of paint left on this thing,
right?
But I remember like there was only a couple very light gouges, probably from hitting something monstrous.
Well, and you think about it, he goes after the trophy trucks, after the trucks with 40s.
Yeah.
Those trucks are 42s now, right? He's got 35s, and he's dragging that thing. And I think that was 2 seasons, if I'm not mistaken.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, we got that back just to show. We clear coated it, right, to show.
It's awesome.
But yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah,
I mean, that thing was literally drugged for hundreds of miles through the desert.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you, because I think it's interesting, is on your bumpers you use, if I'm getting this correct, they're nodular iron recovery points.
Some, yeah.
Now what? And it looks like it's a whole separate part of the bumper. And why do you go with those? And it looks like they even function as a skid a little bit. What are some of the advantage of that kind of a recovery point?
And it's not all are nodular iron that look like they may be. Like, for instance, the first generation Colorado rear bumper was actually aluminum.
Okay.
Half-ton Ram was aluminum, but it was a cast aluminum. It was a very strong alloy, and we did those for weight, right? But in general, with a casting, just the material properties end up being very stiff, and so it ends up the way when we mount it to a bumper, it ends up spreading the load in such a way that it can spread the load more effectively than if we just went with like
plate steel,
if we
or
just had some plate steel in there.
Yeah.
And then there's the added advantage. It ends up looking cool.
They look super cool.
But the original, like when we first did them on the Ram, it was really to get that load spread out. And it just works, and we're doing more and more castings. The problem with castings, they can be really heavy. So, today we're doing a lot of what's called topology optimization. So we can really place the material where we need to be, but end up with a really rigid part.
Wow.
So if you think about like a winch mount, for instance, if it's made out of plate steel, it could yield just like on one frame rail, right? If you're just pulling on one tow hook on the side of a winch mount. But when it's a casting, it's so rigid that it'll start pulling on the other side too. And so we can really spread the load through, even if it's a really asymmetrical pull, we can spread the load through both frame rails. And that's kind of one of the big problems with a lot of these trucks is, especially for us coming in on something that, the truck already exists, right? So we're trying to make a frame rail that was never designed. It was designed to be pushed on, or designed to hold a load from top, but it really was never designed to be pulled on. And so that can be a real struggle, is how to get these load paths through the frame rails. And that's another good thing. Just knowing what I know now, a lot of the aftermarket doesn't necessarily get it right.
Yeah.
Right. When I can look at I can look at most bumpers and be like, I can know what problems we had with the actual structural data and know like 90% of these things, they would never pass either.
Yeah.
They'd never pass because we had to go back and do things. And getting back to that modal, you've had the experience of you getting just the right speed and frequency on a washboard and the whole truck lights up. Well, like if you watch that on slow motion camera, I mean, the whole truck would look like a noodle. And you'd see these things that are amazingly stiff, and all of a sudden it'll start flexing, and you can start, hitting bumpers to headlights, whatever it may be. Or you can, start doing frame damage because this bumper, which may weigh 100 pounds or even more when you have a winch in it, and if you get it to light up at the same frequency as the frame, you can have major issues. And so, that's part of the, that's a good example of testing that, sometimes we have to make our bumpers less stiff. Sometimes we have to make them stiffer. Sometimes we just have to get them out of the range of what the frame would be or what the truck would ever see, frame and suspension. And so we do a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah, you've talked about frequency tuning before, like even in suspension.
Generally in suspension,
yeah.
we do a lot of frequency tuning.
But most aftermarket suspension companies don't do that. I didn't even know about frequency tuning until I talked to Jim Friends, and he's like, "Oh, let me explain how this thing works."
Yeah.
And it was like, "Whoa."
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And that's really easy again in the aftermarket, and that's like the reason we don't do springs on a Ram is because there's, I think, what did I come up with? There's 44 front springs on a Ram 2500 and 18 rear springs. And, as we all know, those OEMs will not spend a penny more than they have to. And yet they've determined that because of all the configurations of truck, there's 44 front springs are required, 18 rear. There's millions of dollars of engineering in all those springs. They're all set for very specific wheelbases, cab configurations, engine configurations. And that's a good thing. Like if you go to the aftermarket and you're looking at your company and you're saying, "Oh, I want a suspension," and if they only offer you a gas or a diesel spring and maybe one rear spring, there's a problem there, right? You're not going to get the best. And again, people have buyer's remorse, so they make a decision because they make a decision, and they'll never admit otherwise. And maybe they don't know. Maybe they've never driven another truck.
Yeah.
But there's very specific reasons why, logically we choose to do things certain ways, right? On a Jeep, we do provide springs because, but we have 2-door and 4-door, and we have gas and diesel and 4xe. We do have those extra springs. So if your aftermarket company is not providing different springs for different jobs, not just different heights or different motor, maybe like in the case of a Ram, that's a good indication that the engineering's not really there.
Interesting. Man, this has been an awesome conversation. I've learned.
My mind is
exactly.
a little blown on that one.
Yeah, I've learned a lot in this, Dave. So, what I've always wanted to ask you this: what are maybe one or two things, a couple things that you've learned when you started doing all of this work that you kind of had set in stone? Like, this is what I believed, and now that you've done all of this with the OEMs, what have you changed your mind on? Like, what was a big thing that you're like, man, in the beginning it was all about big tires, and now I realize this, or what's something that you've really changed your mind on in your own time with your own vehicles? And maybe not. Maybe maybe not. I mean, for me, it was full size
right from day one.
For me, it was full size trucks. Like I always had an aversion to them, and I never owned one. And now they're so good and I enjoyed it. Changed my mind on them.
I think once we started making parts for full-size trucks, I think that started making people look at them a little bit more because those parts exist. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people who it's a hobby, and maybe a full-size truck they can justify more than a Jeep, and now they can have a hobby. But there's also that added capability. For us, we started out really involved with Jeep, And then so many people were like, I want to do this, I want to do this. And it just, I think it was that one trip where I was like, I want a camper Jeep.
Yeah.
And I didn't know how to do it with the weight. And at the time, and so I was like, well, I'm just going to build a Ram and tow a Jeep. It'll never know it's back there, right?
Yep.
The Ram's got a lot of capability because I've been driving Rams around with I don't know if you remember this, but I had a 57-foot wedge trailer.
I remember.
With 4 Jeeps, and I was doing what it took, to get the company off the ground, and I was towing that thing, 32,000 pounds going down the road, right, way over. I mean, never had any issues with it, legally or that, and I wouldn't recommend it. Every time I pulled out of Missoula, I was like, I wonder if this will be the last time
that you get
I'm going to see this, because it was terrifying driving that thing. I mean, the Ram handled it, right? I had a Ram dually. I put hundreds of thousand miles on 2 Ram dualies towing that thing, but it was always terrifying to me towing that much weight, going down the freeway. But I did realize, on the other hand, like, this truck can handle 4 Jeeps on it, 1 over the roof and 3 on the back of the wedge, and it never complained, right? I mean, I warped 1 exhaust manifold because it was a manual, and you could do that then, right? It would allow you to overpower it, but I just realized how much capability those trucks had, and I, again, do not recommend that for anybody.
Yeah, but again, you were trying to make a go of it, the risks that I've seen you take.
Yeah, you have to take risks too.
As an entrepreneur, you have to go all in.
Yeah, and I've always been kind of a high risk, high reward guy, but I always try and really apply logic and talk it over, and talk out loud, and my partner has a great saying about believing your own bullshit.
Yeah.
And so we try not to believe our own bullshit.
Yeah. Don't believe your own press releases.
Don't believe your own press release. That's right. Yeah. That's like number one. And so that's always kind of really steered us right, and steered us to make decisions that aren't necessarily always favorable to our competition. Right.
Yeah.
We're generally more conservative in our claims. And that's always a frustration for me, because, there are other companies that'll just come out, say whatever.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I could sit there. This is a funny thing about consumers, and I'll talk about this for a second. But one of the things that frustrates me a lot is I can walk somebody through all the logical decisions. This must be true. This must be true. This must be true. This is why. And I could sit with somebody for 3 hours, and one of my competitors can come in and say, "No, mine's better." And literally, if a customer wants to believe that one's better, or they think that, because I will tell somebody, this is not going to work for you. This is not, our suspension is not the equivalent of a trophy truck.
Yeah.
Right? Which is not. But it also, goes down the road different. But if I have a competitor come in and be like, oh yeah, we can blast through the Baja at 100 miles an hour, and that's what the customer wants to believe, they will literally believe that, even though I can prove in 12 different ways why that's not the case. And why, physics doesn't lie, and physics doesn't change for one guy versus another.
Yep.
But it's really interesting from a consumer standpoint. There are consumers that just, if they already have their mindset on something, they want to believe it. It's almost not even worth me spending it's not worth me spending my time to go through it with those folks, right? They're the ones that'll come back after 2 more vehicles. They'll come back and say, okay, now I just want.
And that's why these conversations matter so important, right? Yeah. Is for us to try to get out as much quality information as we can, so people can make their own decision. But also recognizing that we're in the golden era of overland vehicles. Who would have thought that in 2023 we'd have this many options, like GMC mid-sizes with 35s and lockers.
Hey, that one's probably the most surprising.
Absolute shocker. Or 392
it always
Wranglers.
Blows my mind when people say, they don't make 4-wheel drives like they used to. And it's like, what? They don't make them ride like they don't make them slow with bad gas mileage and no suspension articulation.
That's right. And rust out in 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're better than they've ever been. It's unbelievable.
And I'll tell you, I've been on some testing with some of the GM vehicles, and some of the stuff that I've seen done with those things is unbelievable. And GM is so conservative, they will never show a photo. There's photos that exist. I think I've shown you some of them, but I mean, what those trucks will do repetitively is just mind-blowing. And again, GM's so conservative, they won't show a picture of a tire 1 inch off the ground, right?
Yeah, I had to go through a lot of permissions because when we went out to the first drive on that 35-inch tire truck, the new Canyon, they were jumping it off this tabletop jump.
Yep.
And I'm like, we got to show it. And they're like, well, yeah, back and forth and back. And finally they're like, yeah, you can show it.
And whatever height they were jumping, I've probably seen it 5 feet higher. Right?
Yeah.
And it's just like,
it was
crazy.
awesome.
Like something that you would never do with a, not a built race truck.
Yeah.
But I've seen them do it in the, granted in the right conditions. And,
Yeah. Professional drivers and everything.
Professional drivers and doing it safely. But it's mind boggling that you can take a vehicle that you can go buy right now and do what I've seen them do, or even in terms of rock crawling, because, it's different, like independent suspension, it's for me, it's really weird because I'm so used to solid axle trucks.
Sure.
But what I've, and I'm not as comfortable driving a independent suspension in serious rocks, but they will do it. And they will. There's different lines, so I'm having to retrain myself now that I'm driving. Now that I'm driving Chevy, but it's fun. But it is amazing what they'll do and what people compared to what people's perception is.
Yeah.
And like that HD, the new Chevy HD,
it's unreal.
The GMC HD. I mean, it is a comfortable truck that'll
so quiet inside.
I couldn't believe it.
Do a lot.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe how capable it was.
It's really impressive.
We took it on our hardest test loop, and it was like nothing.
Nothing, yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah, and so we're working on a kit for 37s on that thing, which
Sweet.
That'll be really cool. Like it's cool on 35s. It's gonna be really, to me, like what I do. It's gonna be really nice with that.
I like that truck on 35s. Like having had the PXL before, it's a little big for like.
Yeah, you had a PXL.
PXL,
yeah.
It's a little big. Where I look at like this 2500 HD, and I'm like, that is the just right.
And it's like a luxury car on the inside.
Yeah.
It's shockingly comfortable.
Really
it's
nice.
Super comfortable.
They are, yeah.
Well, Dave, I got one more question for you. If you had to pick, and if you don't want to answer, we can cut this out later. But if you had to pick between GMC, AEV, regular cab, tray bed, or a Ram regular cab tray bed, which one would you pick?
Oh God, I don't know how you pick on that one.
You've had them both.
Well, I have. To be fair, we did. That the GMC we built for SEMA, it's amazing. I've only driven it short distances.
Okay.
It's still a show truck.
Sure.
That thing does look so good.
It looks bitchin'. Yeah.
And you've seen it in person, right? It's just like, and to think about a 40-inch tire on a GMC.
Yeah.
Like, because to me,
that was on Obtainium.
My brain's still like 10 years ago when I thought GMC was like this old man, chrome, shiny. Mm. It didn't even
Denali.
really. Yeah, I don't really like. To me, GMC never hit my radar. And then to see that company and the amount of effort their marketing team,
taking it so seriously.
They are. Their marketing team and their engineering team.
They care about it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see. And they, they worked with us on that build. And I don't even know if they really knew. They don't know what's cool necessarily, right? They're depending a lot on us to show them what the guys in the overlanding field will think is cool, right? Because a lot of the marketing folks, they just don't know what they see, which isn't necessarily cutting edge. It's like the the classic rack in the back with some Mack tracks and
a roof tent,
a roof tent, and the basic, the starter kit, right? And so it's pretty interesting to see. They let us go really far with that one on a GMC. It's their baby, right?
Yeah.
And they know the Denali. I mean, they know what makes them money. And so they're really trusting us a lot to do stuff like that. And I know it was really well received, which was cool. And I think, now they pick up quick. And so it's pretty cool to see, and I don't know if we'll ever do something like that for production, but it is pretty exciting. And it really did work well. Like in terms of the engineering, that vehicle went together really fast, really easy. There's no suspension changes on that. So that's a stock, what we call ZRX, but that's ZR2 or AT4X. That's the stock, quote unquote, lifted suspension, no modifications. And we were able to fit 40s on with that, with just the flare and some internal rework of the body.
Yeah. So cool. All right, so we got the non-answer on
Yeah, non-answer.
Ram versus. It's okay. It's okay. I totally get it. Because they are different and they're very cool.
It's really, I mean, and again, I don't work with Ford at all, but all these trucks are really good. But I think right now, I would say Chevy and GMC are really putting the most effort into this market.
Yeah, they care about it,
and I think they're going to get rewarded for it.
Yeah.
And they're doing a good job by not assuming that they're necessarily the experts in this field, right? So they came, I guess not to like toot my own horn, but they came to get the good, they were smart enough to get the good advice and try and be on the leading edge of the curve, not just following along by putting, the requirement, the quote unquote starter kit on, like a snorkel and a rack.
Sure.
And
it's not cheesy stuff.
It's the real deal, right?
It's the real deal.
It can really work it works for folks.
And I kind of get what you're saying, where GM kind of came from is, in a way, I expected them to do some cheesy stuff, and they didn't.
And they didn't.
They didn't.
They crushed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, most improved brand for what we do.
Out of nowhere.
Like
in a matter of,
I don't think anybody has made such a huge leap forward. Daddy drove Fords, so I've never been a GM guy, right? And I'm like, when the 2500 was here, I'm like,
yep,
that's
what I thought.
Yeah,
I mean, think about it. The AT4 didn't start until 2019.
Yeah.
That is like a blip in automotive history.
Yeah.
It's a one heartbeat, and we're already got AT4X, AEV, Bison, insanity.
Well, and I think a lot of that goes back to the original Colorado as a group of, kind of like the Rubicon, right? As a small group of enthusiast engineers kind of started putting it together. Gradually, more and more people latched on until now they're like, wait a second, that was really good. Now let's spread this out. Let's make these all, there's a whole market that we're not hitting. And so for them is good, and they're paying attention. And, and there's other manufacturers that are paying attention to what they're doing.
That's the cool thing is what will the responses be?
Yeah.
Well, and there's always lag because unfortunately, even though manufacturers may want to respond right away.
Yeah. Takes time.
You can't always do that,
Yeah.
right? Your chassis may not be set up for it. If you look at the new Colorado, they actually moved the wheel forward 3 inches, and that was a big part of that was to enable the 35s, right?
Yeah.
And you can't just move a wheel forward 3 inches, right?
No.
It takes a while.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of money and a lot of investment, a lot of time, and people's willingness to do the extra work.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing I'll say about GM. I mean, everybody there is really. You don't really get oh, that's not my job, or why
I've never
are we doing
heard
this?
it. Yeah, I've never heard it.
They're really.
They really care about it.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of
genuinely care about overlanding, and a lot of them are overlanders. They're excited about doing it.
Exactly. Yeah, and so it's fun to see, and it is fun to see what the response will be, because I think those trucks are really, I mean, they're good, and they're just everything's getting better and better and better.
Well, and Dave, it's been fun to see you and your company be so successful and do such good work. 20 years we've known each other almost. Mm-hmm. So it's just been really awesome to see you and your team just crush it. So
yeah, and we do have a good team.
Yeah, it takes that for sure.
Yeah, we have a good team, and it's complex work. You're trying to remember every little detail, and I've got the team we have now is awesome, and we're adding to it all the time. But it's
I can't wait to see what you do next.
Yeah, well,
we'll get you back on the podcast when the next surprise from AEV drops. So
yeah, or maybe sooner.
Yeah, awesome, man. Well, Dave, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Appreciate it.
And we'll talk to you all next time.